Ah, you came back. Come in, get comfortable. I'm your wee dark librarian, keeper of places people stop talking about, listener to stories that don't scream, and someone who knows that not all hauntings involve the dead. Tonight we're not talking about ghosts, we're talking about absence. Villages that emptied, roads that forgot where they were going, places where the living left and something quieter stayed behind. Folklore is often interested in what's missing. Not just who died, but who stopped coming home. Because when people leave a place, they don't take everything with them. They leave routines, they leave patterns, they leave expectations behind. And those things don't vanish just because people do. So tonight, we're walking through the places that didn't collapse, didn't burn, and didn't scream for attention, but became wrong anyway. Because folklore doesn't always ask, who died here? Sometimes it asks, who stopped living here first? Most abandoned villages weren't destroyed. They weren't swallowed by fire, and they weren't erased by disaster in a single night. They faded. People left because of clearances, when land was reorganised and families were treated as obstacles. They left because of famine, when staying meant starvation and leaving meant a chance, however small. They left because of disease, because of flooding, because the land itself was reshaped, turned into reservoirs, claimed by estates, or rendered unlivable by forces that didn't care who had lived there before. Folklore pays close attention to how people leave, because there's a difference between destruction and abandonment. Folklore often places lingering presence not at the moment of death, but at the moment routine was broken, where daily life stopped mid-pattern, where fires went out one by one, not in panic, but in resignation, where doors were closed carefully as if someone might return. There are old stories of houses that still remember, not faces, not names, but movement. The way someone moved across a room at the same time each evening. The sound of boots on stone, the rhythm of chores, the weight of repetition. Folklore treats routine as a form of presence. And when routine ends suddenly, something is left unresolved. That's why locals often avoid ruins, not out of fear, but respect. You don't disturb a place that once held lives and never received a proper ending. There's a particular kind of silence that unsettles people. Not wilderness, not open land, but places built for noise that no longer make any. Inns where laughter once spilled into the road, where glasses were raised, where voices overlapped and blurred. Schools where footsteps should echo, but don't, where names vanished from the records before the buildings did. Hospitals where the air feels paused, as if waiting for something that never arrives. Along the coast, there are villages where warning bells once rang, for storms, for tides, for danger. Bells that kept people alive. When those bells stop, it isn't just sound that disappears. It's reassurance. People rarely report seeing things in these places. They hear them. Footsteps on empty floors, voices where no mouths remain, the sound of something being moved, carefully, as if it still matters where it's placed. Folklore noticed this long ago. Sight can be dismissed. Sound feels personal. You can look away from something, but you can't unhear it. Silence itself becomes a haunting, because it doesn't behave the way that silence should. It presses. It listens. It waits. Folklore doesn't just haunt buildings. It follows routes. Old drove roads, disused bridges, crossroads where no signs remain, roads swallowed by moss or water, paths people walked for generations, until one day they didn't. In folklore, spirits don't cling to houses. They follow repetition. Routes remember movement. Paths remember purpose. That's why crossroads appear again and again in folklore, as places where rules loosen, where decisions were made, where travellers paused, where directions mattered. A road that leads nowhere is more unsettling than a ruin, because it promises continuation and then refuses it. People feel uneasy on routes that no longer function, not because they're lost, but because the land remembers being used. Liminal places aren't haunted because something arrived there. They're haunted because something stopped passing through. Some places aren't described as haunted at all. They're avoided. Villages locals won't rebuild. Fields left unused. Ground that people say refuses crops, animals, or children. In folklore, these places aren't angry. They're closed. The land has withdrawn consent. Stories don't describe disasters here. They describe patterns. Nothing thrives, nothing stays, nothing settles properly. People stop trying, and over time, they stop explaining. This is where taboo forms, unspoken rules, and inherited avoidance. Children are told not to play there, without being told why. Folklore doesn't frame this as punishment, it frames it as recognition. Some places, once emptied, do not want to be filled again. In 1930, the people of St Kilda were told that their request to leave had been granted. Not eventually, not after the winter, not when it was easier. Now. Life on the island had become unsustainable. Too dangerous. Too isolated. So they packed what they could, knowing it wasn't everything. But they didn't strip their homes bare. Furniture stayed. Tools stayed. Beds were left as they were. Fires were extinguished, not allowed to burn out on their own. Animals were abandoned because there was no way to take them. When the last boat pulled away, the island didn't collapse. It simply stopped. Folklore rarely describes St Kilda as haunted. It describes it as unfinished. A place where life paused and never resumed. No one returned to rebuild. No one replaced what was lost. The dead didn't stay, but neither did the living. And that, folklore says, is what makes St Kilda feel wrong to some people. Not because something is there, but because something should be. Folklore often starts with the living leaving. Only later do stories of the dead appear. That order matters. The emptiness comes first. The stories follow. People begin to sense presence, not because something arrived, but because something was removed. Absence sharpens perception. A missing sound, a missing routine, a missing life. Folklore fills that space, not with monsters, but with meaning. It gives absence a shape, so it doesn't feel endless. Folklore doesn't invent presence, it responds to loss. One of the strangest things about abandoned places is not that stories gather around them. It's that they keep changing. A village is emptied, a road falls out of use, a settlement disappears from maps. And for a while, people still remember why. They remember the clearance orders, the famine years, the floods, the storms that finally made rebuilding impossible. But memory thins, faster than stone. Names are forgotten first, then dates, then reasons. And when certainty fades, folklore steps in, not to replace history, but to carry it. This is how one place becomes many stories. An abandoned village might begin as a place that people left because they had no choice. A generation later, it becomes a place that people avoid. Another generation on, it becomes a place that people won't explain. The land stays the same. The stones don't move, but the meaning thickens. Stories don't overwrite history. They layer themselves over it. A ruined house becomes unsettled. A collapsed roof becomes a warning. A place that no one rebuilt becomes forbidden ground. And eventually, people stop asking, what happened here? And start asking, what's wrong with this place? Folklore doesn't rush this process. It works slowly, the way abandonment itself does. A story told once sounds like gossip. A story told twice sounds like coincidence. But a story told across generations, that becomes truth. Not because it's proven, but because it lasted. What's especially telling is what people don't say anymore. They don't talk about families. They don't talk about work. They don't talk about daily life. They talk about feelings. How the place feels wrong. How the air feels heavy. How silence there doesn't behave like silence elsewhere. That's folklore, doing its quiet work. It turns loss into atmosphere. It turns absence into presence. And it allows people to talk about displacement, grief, and abandonment without having to name them directly. Because it's easier to say that the land was bad than to say that people were forced to leave. It's easier to say that something lingers here than to say that nothing was ever resolved. So when people say a place is haunted, they aren't always talking about the dead. Sometimes they're talking about memory, with nowhere left to go. Sometimes they're talking about stories that survived, even when the people didn't. Folklore doesn't erase history. It keeps it emotionally accessible. And sometimes the folklore doesn't exist to explain the place at all. It exists so that the silence doesn't have to speak for itself. Abandoned places don't chase people. They don't need to. They wait. Folklore didn't create fear here. It tried to soften it. It gave language to loss when silence felt too heavy to carry. The most unsettling places aren't haunted by the dead. They're haunted by what never returned. By lives interrupted. By routines unresolved. By silence that remembers being loud. Absence doesn't fade. It settles. And once it does, it becomes part of the land. Folklore didn't invent absence. It taught people how to live beside it. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. Not with ghosts, but with questions. Because sometimes the most unsettling places aren't haunted by the dead. They're haunted by what never came back. Next time, we'll step further into the in-between. Roads that lead nowhere. Boundaries people learn not to cross. In the folklore of places the land itself refused. Until then, if you ever stand somewhere that feels too quiet, remember, absence remembers longer than we do. Good night.